Canada cannot afford to pivot away from the United States, but is that necessarily a bad thing? Yeah, let's talk about that.
Instead of focusing on winning arguments, we're teaching the basic fundamentals of sales and marketing and how we can use them to win in the world of politics, teaching you how to meet people where they're at on the issues they care about. Welcome to The Brian Nichols Show.
Well, hey there, folks. Welcome to today's episode of The Brian Nichols Show. I am, as always, your humble host, joining you from our lovely Cardio Miracle Studios here in sunny Eastern Indiana. The Brian Nichols Show is powered by the best heart health supplement in the world, Cardio Miracle. So if you want to learn how to lower your resting heart rate, lower your pump at the gym while improving your resting heart rate, stick around. We'll talk about that later in today's episode. But first, we're digging into all things United States and Canada relationships from a foreign policy standpoint, from a domestic standpoint. Canada seems to have really been reliant on the good old US of A. And more recently, it seems they're trying to pivot away. Some folks say about time. Other folks say, but is that a good thing? Let's dig into that. Joining me here on the show today from Young Voices is Anthony Luca-Baratta. Anthony, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Thanks for having me, Brian. I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing great, man. Great to have you on the show. And I'm really looking forward to today's conversation because peek behind the curtain, I grew up in northern New York State, which I know most folks, they hear upstate New York and they're like, oh, like Schenectady, or oh, like Buffalo. No. You go further north. Oh, like Syracuse. No. Keep going another 2 hours. Canadian border. I feel like Sarah Palin. I can see Canada from my house back when I grew up there. So this is a topic. I mean, I used to go to Canada all the time. We would literally cross the river on a boat before 9/11. You'd dock in Morristown, New York. You'd go across the river. You'd dock over in Brockville or Brockville or Prescott. You'd go out. You'd have a night over there, and you'd come home. Like, it was just, that was the relationship. And fast forward to where we are today in a post 9/11 world, and also as the world's just gotten weirder, that has gone away, right? And I guess, with that, the relationship between the United States and Canada has gotten a little bit more rocky. So we're going to dig into that today. But before we do that, do us a favor, Anthony, introduce yourself here to the Brian Nichols Show audience, and then we can talk about why you're focusing on that United States-Canadian relationship.
Yeah, great. So I'm a Young Voices contributor. I started about a month ago. I write about the Canada-U.S. relationship. I write about all things Canadian politics and policy, a little bit of American politics and policy. I focus mostly on economic and national security issues. And I'm also a contributor to the Center for North American Prosperity and Security, which is the Washington, D.C. based branch of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which is Canada's, in my completely unbiased opinion, best national think tank. So this is a topic that's close to my heart as a writer, but also as a Canadian who spent a little bit of time in the U.S. It's a critical relationship, as you say. It's a little bit on the rocks these days, but I don't think it has to be. I think there's so much in common culturally, economically, strategically, that I really do believe that the relationship could be mended. And so that's what I've been thinking about. Looking forward to discussing that today.
For sure. And you wrote an article over at the National Post. Right. Canada cannot afford to pivot away from the United States. Confronting the threat posed by China, Russia, and Iran without America's help is far beyond Canada's military capacity. I have questions, but before we go there, Anthony, just kind of help us outline the framing of your article here. What was the main goal you were hoping that folks walked away from reading your article with?
Right. So when that article came out, Canada and the European Union had just signed a defense pact, which, it had as a stated goal to further integrate Canada into the European defense industrial system. I'm not necessarily against that, but many commentators were hailing this as a pivot away from the United States. And that's where I thought, that's a terrible idea for a variety of reasons. So what I wanted readers to get out of the article is the realization that despite the weirdness of the past few months, the disruption caused by the Trump administration, the difference in opinion, cross-border over a whole bunch of issues that I'm sure we'll get into, Canada and the United States fundamentally share geopolitical interests. They also share economic interests. I didn't get into those that much in the article, but the geopolitical interests that they share are clear. Brief history, Canada and the United States have fought on the same side of basically every major conflict since World War I. Canada stayed out of Iraq and Vietnam. Some would argue for the best, but really on everything else, we're talking World War I, World War II, Cold War, the war in Korea, as part of the Cold War, Afghanistan, ISIS, NORAD, NATO. Canada and the U.S. have been on the same side of all of these, alliance structures, competitions, and wars. Why is that? And the reason is, in my opinion, simple. Canada and the United States share a continent. They share the longest land border in the world. They share a culture and an economy. They share an interest in a world order that is conducive to world trade, freedom of navigation of the seas, relative peace, preventing the emergence of a hegemon on the Eurasian continent that could threaten the homeland, etc. So we share an interest in preserving, the same world order. And what I say in the article is a world order that's good for America is also good for Canada. Now, the difference between the two countries, obviously, is in the actual hard power that the countries could bring to bear. So while the United States can just say, this is the world order we favor, how can we shape this? Canada has to say, what alliance systems can we be a part of to help shape this, just because of the difference in size, the difference in power. And the argument is, if Canada wants to maintain the world order that has benefited our economy and national security for the last 80 years, it cannot do that without a strong alliance and cooperation with the United States. And frankly, I have yet to hear a plausible alternative to this. Obviously the devil's in the details, but the broad strokes, that's the reality. And that underlying geopolitical reality has not changed just because the U.S. president has a different view of things than his predecessors. So,
yeah, no, for sure. And a couple of things. Let's just kind of start peeling back the layers of the onion here. The first piece I would say is that 1,000% the friendship, right, between the United States and Canada is absolutely valuable. But let me ask you this, Anthony. But friendship, it doesn't necessarily require entangling alliances, right, or perpetuating a new world order, as our old friend Klaus Schwab used to say quite a bit over at the World Economic Forum, where America more or less is playing this global hall monitor. And I hear you, Canada definitely has had a positive outcome from that world order over the past 80, 90 years. And I know in your article you go back to World War I, right? But if Canada wants the consequences of its own politics, shouldn't we let them and not necessarily drag America deeper into costly foreign entanglements that prop up Canada's choices and vice versa, for that matter?
Yeah. I was going to say, it's interesting because you hear this sort of argument on the American side of the border, but you also hear it on the Canadian side, right? Why does Canada need to just, be the little brother to America's big brother, following them wherever they go? There's the whole world policeman argument. What I would say to that is that the world order, by the way, not new world order, very old world order established after World War II, which is what I'm advocating. That world order was pursued by the United States not out of a sense of altruism, but out of a sense of self-interest. So the United States realized, perhaps a little bit belatedly, but realized that because of a few things. One, the geographical isolation of the United States. It had an interest in maintaining a foreign policy that made it safe to pursue the domestic policies that would lead to its own prosperity and security. So look up, from whoever the hostile actors might be at any point in history. So to understand this fully, you sort of have to go even further back to British foreign policy. So British foreign policy throughout the 7th to 18th and 19th centuries was focused on maintaining what was called a balance of power on the European continent. The idea being, if Europe is dominated by one hostile force, what is called in the jargon a hegemon, that would eventually threaten the homeland. And it did on several occasions. Now, the United States has pursued a very similar policy to that since World War II, because it realized that essentially what applied to Britain in those centuries applied to it. So, for instance, at the beginning of World War I and the beginning of World War II, the United States wanted to be a more or less, it wanted to continue pursuing a sort of neutral shipping policy with the rest of the world. But of course, countries that are at war don't see commerce with their enemies as neutral in any way. And so American, not just military assets, but civilian assets were directly threatened by this. So at some point, the United States realized, look, if we want to make the world safe for us, never mind the rest of the world, safe for us, our civilians, our shipping, our homeland, we have to have a forward posture that prevents Europe, Asia, the Middle East, these sort of critical points in the world, from descending into chaos or from being dominated by a hostile force. And so that is what I'm advocating for on the American side, because I just think it's worked. But I'm also advocating for the Canadians to be involved in the maintenance of that order, because it works for Canada as well. So it's in the mutual interest of both countries to continue doing that, not because we're just best friends and we want to give each other big bear hugs, but because it's in our mutual interest. And historically, a realist foreign policy, which I know the president is all about, is based on mutual interest. Historically speaking, alliances have not been about, we just care about the other country so much. It's like, let's look at what interests we have in common and let's see how we could pursue those together.
You're trying to stay sharp, whether it's for work, learning, or just not forgetting where you left your keys. Been there. But lately, the mental fog hits hard. And brain fog isn't just stress. It's often tied to poor blood flow and low nitric oxide levels, because your brain needs oxygen just as much as your other muscles do. Because without it, you're slower to process, less focused, and more fatigued. And that's one of the many reasons why I trust Cardio Miracle. Not only does it boost nitric oxide for heart and circulation, it supports cognitive clarity, focus, and even mood regulation thanks to its unique blend of L-arginine, CoQ10, vitamin D3, and antioxidant-rich superfoods. So if you're tired of feeling mentally cloudy, give your brain what it's craving. Click the link in the show notes, scan that little QR code over my shoulder, or head to cardiomiracle.com/TBNS, which will give you 15% off your order. Just look for the little note on the website saying you're shopping with Brian Nichols. One more time, that's cardiomiracle.com/TBNS. And now, let's get back to the show. So, Anthony, really quick, I mean, I'm not trying to pick on the historical points you've raised in the article, but like, I think this is just the reality across the board, is that history isn't always as clean as the history books like to make it. So like World War I, for example, the U.S. wasn't necessarily dragged in to the war reluctantly. I mean, there was the banking ties to Britain. You had the Lusitania controversy, the good old-fashioned Zimmerman telegram, right? That was exploited to help shift public opinion. World War II, Pearl Harbor. I mean, yes, it was absolutely a real attack, but the U.S. embargoes and our military posturing arguably escalated the tensions with Japan beforehand. The Cold War, our interventions in Korea, Vietnam, and Latin America, they often far went beyond just protecting the homeland, right? I mean, they were just about as much economic and political control. So I guess my it's not necessarily an objection. It's just the context. I think it's important is that if we're going to invoke the messiness of history, we have to at least acknowledge the full history here, right? Including where the United States or Britain actually created conditions for economic and warfare conflicts, right? So, I mean, that's one piece, and it kind of piggybacks into an overarching, I guess, a vibe that we've seen, right? And that is the historical narratives being questioned in 2025. We see this quite a bit, and I know Daryl Cooper is everybody's favorite boogeyman to beat up right now. But I mean, we have to be able to remove the Hollywoodification of history, right? Like, I think of World War II, and I'm sure everybody else who thinks of World War II, we instantly think of Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, like shows like that, right? Movies like that. And while those narratives that we've been promoted in media, promoted in our textbooks, they paint the U.S. involvement as reluctant yet noble, right? I mean, on the other side, though, the United States hasn't really had, too many times where we've really been dragged to war. It's actively, in many circumstances, created the situations and circumstances to justify entering them. So doesn't it actually, in turn, kind of put Canada more at risk, because now they're partnering with a country like the United States, who is going out and this is like, the opposite of the Teddy Roosevelt speak softly and carry a big stick. We're speaking loudly, carrying a big stick, and using that big stick wherever we see fit. Is there not a danger there from a Canadian standpoint as well?
I think so. I mean, fears of entangling alliances have haunted the United States, especially since its founding. So I would take issue with a little bit of your characterization. I mean, I'm not one of these, America good, everyone else bad kinds of people. But there was actually a reluctance, and the reluctance in the United States, especially during World War I and II, it might not have been coming from the same people who were more pro-war. So there were the two factions, but the isolationist bent in the United States was very strong from the beginning. So George Washington, for instance, in his farewell address, warned of the dangers of entangling alliances. From America's founding, there's been this view that to be involved in the world is not only to engage in this sort of backwards European, Machiavellian foreign policy. It was also to have to implement, heavy-handed policies at home, right? To maintain a standing army and a navy, and then later an air force. You have to have a certain level of taxation, and that might require a bigger national security state, et cetera, et cetera. So that way of thinking was very prominent, especially in the U.S. Congress, at the beginning of the Second World War. Now, the president, FDR, I don't think ever fully bought into this. So he was more pro-war from the beginning. So I guess when I say reluctantly, I'm talking about the U.S. as a whole, not necessarily, the administration of the time. I will admit that FDR was not himself reluctant to get involved, at least as far as I know. But the U.S. as a whole definitely was. Now, you talk about how the United States, if I'm understanding this counter argument correctly, that the United States might in some sense look for hotspots to get involved in. Maybe the United States is a little bit too trigger happy. Is that am I understanding that?
I mean, we only need to look at I think it was General Wesley Clark with the outline of a post 9/11 world where we're going to go into Afghanistan and we're going to go into Syria, into Libya, into Iran, and all these countries, which we ended up going into. And by the way, in your article, you outline Canada, I almost said Canada, sorry, Canada, right behind us, right? They were sending 40,000 plus troops over to the Middle East during these conflicts. So I would say sometimes that's absolutely the case.
Yeah, for sure. No, it is sometimes. So, okay. So what I would say is that the sorts of people, the sorts of arguments against my argument, right? Maybe more of the isolationist side of things, realist, libertarian, whatever you want to call them, will often say things like to people like me, who are more hawkish on foreign policy. To you guys, everything is like World War II. You see Hitlers everywhere, and the United States has to go out and defeat Hitlers. And
by the way, just to that point, I would say that we do say that a lot because that's usually the vibe we hear. I mean, how many times have we heard the Nazi Hitler type of comparison evoked here in the Palestinian conflict over in Gaza with Israel, right? Like that's brought up daily.
Right. Yeah. I mean, okay. So let's put Israel-Palestine aside because I feel like that's a whole episode in and of itself. But going back to the objection of everything is Hitler, what I would respond to that is, you're right. You can't overuse historical analogies. Not everyone is Hitler. Okay. But what I would also say is not everything is neocon Iraq. Right. There are actually wars worth fighting. The second thing I would say is that I think that there's a tendency on some sections of the right and left today to view war as more or less like this special thing that you can just choose to engage with or not. Whereas my view of war is closer to General von Clausewitz's famous characterization that war is a continuation of politics by other means. So there are simply certain interests that I just think are worth fighting for. Now, the other thing to say is that a hawkish foreign policy is often, in my view, the best way of actually preventing war. I remember the night, for instance, that President Trump decided to attack the Iranian nuclear facilities. I had friends asking me, because they knew that I wrote about this stuff, is this the beginning of World War III? I said, no, this is going to help prevent World War III. When you have hostile forces that are armed with nuclear weapons or that are given free rein to do whatever they want, that is an incentive for them to do more of that. And that will eventually, in my view, drag powers like the United States into war anyway, just in a weaker position, because again, the fundamental interests of the United States are to have a world that is structured a certain way. Let me give you one last example. Why do I think that both the United States and Canada have an interest in maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific? It's not because my heart just bleeds for the Taiwanese and I just really want them to maintain control over those semiconductor manufacturing facilities. No, it's because 80% of the world's shipping goes through the Indo-Pacific. China is a hostile force, and we need those microchips. I mean, I care about primarily myself, my family, my country. And I think same for you Americans on your side of the border. I think you should care primarily, mostly about your family, your country. So again, the thing that I'm advocating for is the pursuit of American self-interest, Canadian self-interest. I just happen to believe that self-interest sometimes involves military commitments. No, the United States should not be going around the world looking for regimes to overthrow. But what it should be doing is asking the question, why has the United States been so involved in the world since World War II? Why? And I think the answer is simple. It realized that if it was not, then there would be a constant danger to the homeland. And so, the United States Navy, United States Air Force, United States Army have been harbingers of stability around the world. The Indo-Pacific has
Anthony,
been. Yeah.
To that, though, what's the limiting principle, right? Because if we were to take this mentality to the end conclusion, right? There is no period where America should take a back seat. It sounds like, based on this framing, that so long as America is the global police, or call them what you will, and doing so at the behest of promoting American interest, right? Then that becomes the justification to, start to look for those regimes. Because if I start to say, oh man, well, all of a sudden that Suez Canal, it's getting more and more difficult to start getting goods through there. Maybe we start to do some overthrowing of regimes there. Or, the Panama Canal, that's starting to get a little, hairy down there. Maybe we should start going to war down there. Like, it opens up the Pandora's box of enabling and almost excusing away any American foreign policy if we can always root it back to, well, this isn't the pursuit of the American, best interest or best policy for the American populace. So I guess to all that, what is the limiting principle? Where would you even say, okay, this is enough, right? We don't need to do any more of these regime changes or American policing. What would that look like?
Yeah. So first of all, I think the United States should almost never enter a war just for regime change. So just right off the bat, I don't think regime change as a general rule is a good reason to go to war. So we're going to agree completely on that. Now, by the way,
really quick, just to make sure we're being fair here, though, but that's never the argument, right? It's always Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, right? So we need to go overthrow him. Bashar al-Assad is gassing his own people, so we got to go overthrow him. It's never an argument of we just want to overthrow this bad guy, unless it's Muammar al-Gaddafi. But hey, he was trying to go to the gold standard and also was talking about getting nukes himself. So we got to get rid of him, right? So there's always some underlying reason that's promoted as to why we should do these. So I think it's important to put that framing in there. Running a small business means adapting on the fly, hiring, scaling down, shifting teams based on seasonal projects. But most phone systems, they lock you into a set number of users and then make it a pain to adjust. And on the contrary, that's where Level 365 shines. Add or remove users anytime. Month-to-month plans, scale up when you need it, scale down when you don't. It's flexibility that actually matches how your business works. No headaches, no overpaying for empty seats. Just phones that move with you, and that is what makes Level 365 different.
Yeah. Well, we do, we have to use our critical faculties, right? If the politicians are saying one thing, but they're actually pursuing something else, we can rightfully critique them on what we actually observe them doing. So of course, there's always going to be a level of doublespeak with this kind of thing. But to go back to your earlier question, what's the limiting principle? First of all, I will answer the question directly, but the first thing I would say is, on the view that the United States should more or less, either never be involved in conflict around the world or be extremely reluctant to do so, you could ask the same question. What's the limiting principle to that? Would you go as far as saying, for instance, that the United States should have never been involved in the Second World War? I know that not everything's a Second World War. I've acknowledged that. But if you do have this sort of strong isolationist bent, then you, I think, have to ask the same question about yourself. So what I would say is...
really quick, can I just point out the word that you use there, isolationist? Is there a reason that you want to use that versus like non-interventionist?
Yeah, we could use non-interventionist if you prefer.
Well,
I know,
I think they're fundamentally
yeah.
different things. That's why I'm calling it out, because isolationist is saying, hey, I'm in my own little bubble, right? I'm the guy out in the woods by myself, and nobody's coming to harass me. I don't want to deal with anybody. I frankly don't want them to deal with me. So I'm just going to be out here on my own. Non-interventionist is saying, hey, I'll be friends with everybody, right? I'll be the guy having the big house on the corner, and you want to come by and trick or treat, by all means. You want to come do business with me, by all means. But you're picking a fight with a guy down the road, I'm not going to come help you fight that guy. I'm not involved in this. That would, I'd say, is a fundamental difference between isolationism and non-interventionism. So I do want to just call that out, that not all non-interventionists are non-isolationists. Or rather, not all non-interventionists are isolationists. Does that make sense?
For sure, that makes sense.
Okay.
I guess my response would be that the two become the same thing in certain contexts. So if your fundamental approach to the world is, hey, if you want to be friends with me, I want to be friends with you, that paradigm does not leave open the door to, okay, you don't want to be friends with me, and you're doing things that are harming me. Okay, so now what? Right? So
define harm for me.
Well, I mean, it's if, say, China were to become the hegemon in the Indo-Pacific, there's good reason to believe that this might cause, economic harm to the world somewhere on the level of the Great Depression because of the semiconductors that are manufactured in.
But wouldn't
Taiwan,
it hurt them too?
For instance, who, China?
Yeah, I mean they are almost entirely an export nation. They would be crippled economically if they were to do something like that to disrupt world trade. They rely almost, I say entirely, a very large portion of their exports are going right to America. So I mean that's almost like, what's the expression, Michael Scott, biter knows a spider face, right? Like that's the whole kind of same vibe, no?
Absolutely. And so I mean, and people use this argument for years to say, well, this is why China is never going to do that. Now, look, I hope you're right. I mean, I hope China realizes that it's not in their self-interest to do this, because I certainly don't think it is. But when you have a nation that is ideologically hostile to your own, I mean, China is a communist totalitarian state, and they say things explicitly like, we need to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. My argument is take it seriously. Take it seriously. Don't launch a preemptive attack. Don't start saying things like, we're going to overthrow the Communist Party. And to be fair, nobody has, as far as I know, nobody has said this. But don't say things like that. But yeah, say things like, we are going to have a foreign policy posture that disincentivizes China from doing that thing. So that's how you define harm. But I do want to return to like what's the limiting principle question.
Yeah, because I keep on going on tangents. My bad.
Yeah. No worries. Yes, the limiting principle has to be something like, and for the people who are the most non-interventionist in your audience, I know that this is not going to be satisfying. I recognize that, but the limiting principle has to be something like, you have to take a look at your goals, and then you have to take a look at your resources, and then you have to do a cost-benefit analysis of where is more worth investing in, where do we have to perhaps rely more on allies, and where do we need to pull back. This is going to be a case-by-case thing. I mean, there's a good argument, for example, that the United States should be a little bit more withdrawn in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, for instance, to be able to invest more in Asia. I think, Eldridge Colby, a Trump administration official who's been really influential on this, seems to believe this. The president himself has been quite reluctant, for instance, to continue being perpetually involved in European security because he wants to invest more resources elsewhere. I'm not against those calculations. In fact, that's good. The United States, no power has ever succeeded in being the sole hyperpower that governs the world itself in perpetuity. This is just not a thing. It's not possible. And I'm not saying the United States should be that. What I am saying is the United States should maintain a role in world governance, because, again, I think that the United States, countries like the US, Canada, Britain, are uniquely dependent on the international situation for their own economic and security interests.
So I hear the fact that, and just going back to the root article that we're building this on today, your article over the National Post. So we're talking about Canada specifically and the US having shared interests, right? And keep me honest here, but it seems that the argument you're making is that our shared interests from a national security standpoint are inseparable, right? And I would say, though, Anthony, that does ignore, though, that America and Canada fundamentally have had and many times continue to have different priorities, that it risks bringing one another into these foreign conflicts. And again, we've used the example of the Middle East entanglements back in, the early 2000s at the turn of the millennia. Like that has little to nothing to do with Canadian interests, but it was more so done with, America's geopolitical overreach. And I hear what you said earlier, like not everything is in Afghanistan or a Syria or in Iraq, but those are the most recent ones we really have to look to. And it does play into kind of this overarching theme. And by the way, like I would think we'd be remiss not to talk about the fact that Canada by itself has become a much more left-leaning political country. Mm-hmm. And it seems that Canada has become less focused on becoming its own entity and living by its own type of sovereignty. And instead, and I'm using this term very loosely, but almost become a parasitic country where it's living at the behest of American and European countries leading the way. So when you look at it that standpoint, like, sure, Canada can say that we don't want to do X, Y, and Z, or we want to do X, Y, and Z, but at the end of the day, do they really say anything to actually promote that? And from a left-wing policy, I've seen the opposite, right? I've seen Trudeau in the prime minister role for well over a decade, almost at this point, right? And then it went over to Mike Carney. What the hell is his name? Mark Carney. Yeah. So like you're obviously not going more and more right. You're going farther and farther to the left, even though some folks are claiming that Mark Carney is more of a kind of independent. But just a few years ago, we had the trucker protests in Canada, banks being shut down because of these truckers. They just draconian authoritarian approach to forcing vaccinations during the COVID pandemic. Like all these things from a domestic policy standpoint, I would say, man, Anthony, I'm trying to be fair here, but like, the old H.L. Mencken quote, right? Democracy is the idea that the common person knows what they need and they deserve to get it good and hard, right? At what point does Canada, does the United States, does all these other countries just have to stop, take a step back and say, you know what? We're kind of getting what we deserve here. We're getting what we wanted good and hard by voting for these continuations of broken policies or pushing us further to the left. And why should it be that other countries that are partners with these countries have to foot the bill in some way, shape, or form? So like, if we were to say Canada and America from our national security standpoint and our best interest standpoint need to have a geopolitical force on a global stage, okay, make that argument. But why should it be that America needs to pay for Canada and vice versa versus just saying, Canada, y'all pay attention and take care of your stuff. We're going to pay attention, take care of our stuff. Europe, you pay attention, take care of your stuff. Because by the way, geopolitically speaking, I think we're going to be way better to deal with things over here in the Western Hemisphere because, that's where we are versus over in the Eastern Hemisphere, and leverage our allies over in those areas to start playing the role they can. And when we have shipping lanes, for example, yes, play defense, but not this weird like defensive, offensive posture that we run at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think this is the portion of this conversation where we're going to have the most agreement. Actually, I don't think that that Canada should in any way be what it has been for the last 10 years, which is essentially an economic and geostrategic laggard that takes the United States for granted. So for instance, I wrote an article back in February. And the thesis of the article, I think, ended up being wrong, but I think a lot of the things in it, I stand by. So basically what I said in that article was something like Trump is using the tariffs as leverage because he wants Canada to stop doing certain things, and he has every right to want Canada to stop doing those things. Oh, and by the way, Canada should stop doing those things because it's also good for Canada. So one of these things was the defense spending bit. There is no reason that Canada should continue lagging behind on NATO spending, for instance, and then just assuming that the United States is going to be there to protect it. We should hold our own on defense. Absolutely agreed. There is no reason why the Canadian federal government should continue protecting industries like dairy, like poultry, farming, because First of all, it harms Canadian consumers. And second of all, it's not fair to American farmers. Now, to be fair, the United States also has some protection policies in the agricultural industry. Most developed nations do. So, those need to go as well, in my opinion. But that doesn't give Canada the excuse, again, to be a laggard on this. When Trump started talking about how we have to take our shared border more seriously, especially in regards to fentanyl, the immediate response from a lot of Canadians was, well, most of the fentanyl going into the United States comes through your southern border, not your northern one. That's true, but that doesn't give us the right to just allow fentanyl to flow through to the American border. To be fair, I think Canada has started taking action on that. So I agree with you. Okay. The fact that President Trump has succeeded in getting the Europeans to finally take their own national security more seriously, rather than, again, using United States military spending to essentially subsidize their welfare states, right? They get to spend less on their military, spend more on social programs. Not a problem, because the US is going to be there to defend us. That paradigm is now over. That's a good thing, right? Okay. All that being said, I think the United States needs to continue to monitor the situation, and again, for its own self-interest, continue being involved, continue spending, continue having a forward posture where it needs to. And I emphasize where it needs to, right? So, like we already talked about the European example, we could use the Canadian Arctic as another example of this. The United States should not be solely responsible for protecting the Arctic. We have to do our role. The Arctic, after all, is Canadian territory, right? I mean, we should be the ones taking the lead on that. But at the end of the day, if the United States needs to contribute, again, for its own self-interest, to plug the holes that a smaller country like Canada will never be able to plug, I don't see why that's a problem. But overall, your picture, I think, is correct. Nations have their own self-interest, which they should not rely on others to fulfill. They should all do what they can. We should all pull our weight. And just lastly, on the economic questions, the left-wing drift of Canadian politics over the last 10 years, I say hear to everything you said. I mean, we need to liberalize our resource industry. We need to make Canada a better place to do business. We need to stop having industry killing climate policies. We need to get rid of supply management. We need to liberalize our housing market. I mean, on and on and on. Like, I don't like the left-wing drift of Canadian politics any more than you do. So.
Mm-hmm. So I will give my final thoughts, and I'll turn it over to you to bring us home. This is a reoccurring final thought I've had here on the show whenever we talk foreign policy, and specifically, and I'm not picking on you today, but it's more so whenever I hear other countries arguing that America needs to lead on a global scale, and it's usually at the behest of the best interest of those other countries, right? And I hear all the arguments, I hear all the good critical thinking kind of framing of why we should be doing X, Y, and Z. But at the end of the day, right, and this is what I think we always have to get back to, is that all this sounds good in theory, in ivory towers, but when you go down to the average person, folks are getting tired, man. Folks are getting tired of seeing our literally billions of dollars go overseas to try and promote global prosperity, to promote economic certainty, to promote all these good feeling things, when we are suffering at the domestic standpoint in America. And I know, folks say, oh, America's, you're one of the best countries from a GDP standpoint. Everybody seems to be, no, everybody's not happy. We're watching as billions of dollars are going over to the Middle East, going over to Eastern Europe, going over to the Indo-Pacific, going all over the world in the pursuit of global police, spreading freedom and democracy, whatever. Meanwhile, we have horrible natural disasters and man-made disasters happening here in America. People suffering. We see, just the rampant drug use in these big cities, and people are getting tired of it. So my concern is, and I think I raised this up back, not our last episode with Abdullah Hayek, but the first one, is that you're going to get to a point where people are going to say, you know what? Back to what you were saying earlier, why I want to call out the differentiation between non-interventionism and isolationism, is that for those Americans who maybe are more non-interventionist, the more and more that we continue to spread ourselves too thin, to send our money overseas to promote doing good, the more you're going to get people pissed off here in America, and they're going to go away from saying, you know what, instead of America first, America only, right? And if that's the case, then what's going to happen to Canada, right? What's going to happen to Australia? What's going to happen to Ukraine? What's going to happen to Israel? What's going to happen to Taiwan? All of these democratic bastions of hope and freedom in certain respective geopolitical areas all of a sudden are going to be on their own, not because the folks in the ivory towers writing thought papers and stuff, all of a sudden they're not going to be important, because the average voter is going to say, enough of this. I'm going to vote for politicians who are going to take my self-interest and put those into policy, which means we're going to start pulling back. And by the way, we're seeing this right now, right? So that's my concern, Anthony, is that the more we continue to push this geopolitical American police world mentality, I hear you in the areas you say we need to, but the more we continue to say, well, we need to do it here, and we need to do it here, and we need to do it here, that's just going to lead to more and more American voters saying, you know what? Enough. And we're going to get more and more to the political right, I think, in terms of how we're going to start electing politicians to then put policy in place that will pull America back on a global stage. And I don't think it's going to be better, to your point, for the world, but it's because we haven't done this in the mentality of let's do this to maintain, structure. And we've done it more so to promote a certain ideology. Like this was the whole argument during the Cold War, was to take down communism, right? No. And I hear and this is, the William F. Buckley approach. Like, hey, you're right, libertarians. We shouldn't have this global superpower, but this big evil country called the USSR is out there. They're communists and they're using the Leviathan state. So, if we want to fight back, we have to use a Leviathan state too. And then the Cold War went away and USSR went away 30 years ago. Did we scale things back? No, no, we did not. We actually scaled things up, right? And that's the part that for more folks who are truly non-interventionist, we say, okay, where is the limiting principle? If there's always another boogeyman to go after, then you're always going to be in pursuit of the boogeyman versus in the pursuit of what we would consider the ideal, which is a scale back American foreign policy, investment not into American, supremacy, but rather American dominance domestically, right? I'm a libertarian. I don't want to see tax dollars being shoveled towards, subsidies or tax breaks, but my goodness, I don't want to see them spent on, a $70 billion airplane to go fight a war overseas. What could that $70 billion do to help, revitalize a community? Like I think there's objective areas where American taxpayers are saying, why are we doing X, Y, and Z at the expense of Flint, Michigan getting good drinking water, or East Palestine, Ohio, not having toxic sludge from a train derailment go into our drinking water, or down in Asheville, North Carolina, where the entire interstate was wiped away from a hurricane, or in Maui, where we had horrible wildfires and literally entire communities burned to the ground, right? And you get $600, right? That's where Americans are getting frustrated. So Anthony, I said a lot. There's my final thoughts, but do us a favor, bring us home. What are your final thoughts for today? And of course, what would you like the folks to take away from your article?
Yeah. So first of all, I think that libertarians should continue to raise the concerns that you've raised to keep the extreme hawks honest. Okay. So that's the first thing I want to say. I mean, you raise a lot of good points. It is a huge problem, both from a sales pitch perspective and just from a moral perspective, to have the sorts of horrible conditions that you just outlined, in East Palestine and places like Flint, Michigan, after the natural disasters, all that stuff. So first things first, I agree with you. Let's have good domestic policy. Let's just do domestic policy right. I think that people who are thoughtful, who have a hawkish view of foreign policy like I do, but who are thoughtful about it, will say, it is too much to ask of the American taxpayer to police the world, but also watch their own country deteriorate. I mean, that is too much to ask. That is not right. And that needs to be fixed. However, I also do think that there is a sales element to this, where the elites, and I'm perfectly comfortable using this language, the elites who are in favor of this hawkish foreign policy need to explain it better to the American people. Like I think actually President Trump did, for instance, when he bombed Iran recently. I mean, polls showed that a huge swath of the American population, vast majority of Trump voters, were actually in favor of it, because first of all, it was a limited strike, and second of all, the interests were very clear. They were clearly explained. Trump is not always the most eloquent at explaining his logic, but he was in this case. So I think you need to have this is a perfect sort of example of what I'm in favor of. Strategic, calculated, limited intervention where American interests are on the line, combined with sound, clear explanations to the American people, and messaging and policy that says Americans are our first priority. Those all have to go together. So my general message would be, look at the history, ask yourself, why did the US rebuild Europe after World War II? Why has it been policing the Indo-Pacific? Why did it take a leading role in the Middle East? It did so for the benefit of the United States. Yes, it benefited those countries as well, right? But it benefited the United States through the expansion of markets, through and trade ties, that kind of thing. On the Canadian issue, I guess to Canadian listeners, I would just say everything I just said, that is in the interest of the United States, it's in our interest as well, and we have to pull our weight in maintaining that. That's why the alliance with the United States is important.
Anthony Luca-Baratta, this has been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I hope folks got some value from today's conversation as well. And if you did, please go ahead, give it a share when you do tag yours truly at B Nichols Liberty on X, Instagram, and on Facebook. Anthony, where can folks go ahead and reach out to you if they want to continue the conversation and learn more from today's conversation?
Yeah, so you should feel, first of all, I really enjoyed the conversation as well, Brian. Thanks for having me. Yeah, you can follow my work at the Macdonald Laurier Institute website. If you just Google my name, I'm sure the articles I write will come up, and you can feel free to connect with me or follow me on LinkedIn. As I said in a previous show, I haven't succumbed to the Twitter X temptation yet, so I unfortunately don't have an X handle to hand out, but maybe that'll change in the near future.
Oh man, good old X. It's an experience. It's an experience, especially with Grok AI out there going rogue every now and then. All right, Anthony, with that being said, we're going to go ahead and put a pin in today's conversation. Again, folks, if you got some value, go ahead, give today's episode a share. And of course, you can go ahead and find the Brian Nichols Show over on your favorite podcasting platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, or wherever it is you get your podcasts. As for video, we air the show live every Monday, Thursday, and Fridays over on Rumble and over on X and Facebook. So if you want to go ahead and check it out live, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And of course, if you want to watch it whenever you like to watch your shows, YouTube, Rumble, Twitter, Facebook, it will be uploaded evergreen over there as well. Also, some housekeeping. We had some issues. And by some issues, I aired one episode over on my brand new show, The Wellness Fix, with Dr. John Richardson talking about cancer. And guess what? YouTube didn't like it. So they literally nuked the entire channel. So we're going to probably do those shows over on Rumble. And I might not do it every week. I think what we might do is do a once a month special show. I don't know. We're going to figure that out. And then as for the Friday show, I know we're going to switch it up to the Sales to Success show. I'm just going to keep that to own independent thing. So you know what, folks? I know we're going to do a big change here at the show. Brian's only going to do one Brian Nichols show a week. Now we're probably going to do 3. So lots of stuff has been happening behind the scenes. Thanks, YouTube, for just being the big censorious bullies you guys are. But I digress. With that being said, Anthony, I really appreciate today's conversation. Any final words or thoughts before we say goodbye today?
Go check out the article. Yeah. NationalPost.com, Anthony Luca-Baratta. Canada cannot afford to pivot away from the U.S.
Links in the show notes, folks. Right. Again, thank you for joining us. With that being said, Brian Nichols signing off here on the Brian Nichols Show for Anthony Luca-Baratta. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for listening to the Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.